The obsidian stallion collapsed outside Dr. Elias Boone's clinic like a fallen monument, its powerful frame hitting the scorched earth, with a sound that echoed off every adobe wall in Copper Ridge. Blood mixed with frothy saliva at its muzzle, and each breath came as a desperate rattle that spoke of imminent death. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the animal's heaving flanks, turning the dusty street into a furnace. Elias dropped his medical journal and vaulted over the porch railing, his weathered boots striking the packed dirt with urgent purpose. Sweat immediately beaded on his forehead as he knelt beside the magnificent beast, his experienced hands moving across coal-black hide that was slick with perspiration and crimson. "Easy there, big fellow," he murmured, probing for the source of bleeding. His fingers found a bullet wound high on the right shoulder edges, blackened with infection that told of days spent fleeing across the merciless desert. The metallic click of a hammer being drawn back made his blood turn to ice water. "Move away from that horse and you die where you kneel." The voice belonged to a woman, low and controlled as a winter wind through canyon walls. Elias slowly raised his head to find himself staring into the face that had decorated wanted posters from El Paso to Sacramento. Mara DeWitt stood 3 feet away, her Colt .45 trained with rock-steady precision on his temple. She wore a duster of dark leather, dust-caked and travel-stained, her auburn hair pulled back beneath a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across angular cheekbones. Behind her, armed figures moved like wolves between the buildings, her gang positioning themselves with the efficiency of long practice. The air itself seemed to thicken with menace as rifles appeared at windows and behind water barrels. "You're going to save him," Mara said, her weapon never wavering. "And if he dies, so do you." Dr. Elias Boone had served as Copper Ridge's only physician for 8 grueling years, ever since Doc Patterson had been gunned down in Murphy's saloon over Confederate war debts. At 42, he possessed the lean, sun-weathered appearance of a man who'd stitched more bullet wounds than he cared to remember. His graying hair was perpetually disheveled from long nights, treating everything from mining cave-ins to Apache arrow punctures, and his hands bore the permanent stains of carbolic acid and dried blood. The 2-story wooden structure housing his clinic had become the town's unofficial sanctuary. Injured miners stumbled through his doors at all hours, their bodies mangled by explosions and rockfalls. Ranchers brought children burning with scarlet fever. Even hardened gunfighters occasionally sought his services, knowing that Doc Boone asked no questions and reported no crimes to Sheriff Morrison. But trust was a luxury Elias could no longer afford to give. 3 months earlier, his world had shattered when outlaws struck the First National Bank of Copper Ridge just after dawn. The raid had been swift and merciless, 6 riders in long coats sweeping through town like death's own cavalry. They'd killed the bank manager and 2 townspeople who tried to resist, then vanished into the wasteland before pursuit could be organized. 8-year-old Emma Boone had been walking to school when the shooting erupted. A stray bullet had found her small chest, piercing clean through her right lung. Despite her father's frantic efforts to save her, infection had claimed her life 3 agonizing days later. Elias had held his daughter's fevered hand as she slipped away, feeling more helpless than during all his years practicing frontier medicine. The memory was seared into his mind with brutal clarity. Emma's small body convulsing with each labored breath, her fever-bright eyes looking to him for salvation he couldn't provide. When he'd extracted the bullet from her chest, he'd noticed something distinctive, a small D, enclosed in a perfect circle carved into the lead itself. It was a custom marking, the kind used by specialty ammunition manufacturers to identify their premium work. Everyone knew the DeWitt gang had been responsible for the bank raid. Their signature was unmistakable: swift strikes, military precision, and those distinctive long coats that made them look like harbingers of apocalypse. But knowing and proving were different things entirely, and the outlaws had left no concrete evidence beyond devastation and grief. Mara Blackcoat DeWitt had earned her fearsome reputation through calculated violence, rather than random brutality. Unlike other outlaw gangs that terrorized entire regions, her crew followed strict rules of engagement. They targeted banks' trains and federal payrolls, but maintained an iron code: no harm to women, children, or anyone who surrendered without resistance. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy. Dead innocents brought federal marshals and cavalry units with unlimited resources. Living witnesses brought only local sheriffs with limited jurisdiction and manpower. The woman herself remained an enigma wrapped in gunsmoke and legend. Some claimed she'd been a Confederate colonel's daughter who'd lost everything when Sherman's army marched through Georgia. Others whispered she'd been a schoolteacher whose husband was murdered by claim jumpers, driving her to seek vengeance on a system that had failed to protect the innocent. Her midnight stallion was legendary throughout the territories. The great horse had carried her out of impossible situations, leaping across canyon gaps that would kill lesser mounts and outrunning cavalry horses across terrain that resembled the surface of hell itself. To see Mara DeWitt approaching meant death rode on 4 hooves, and every lawman from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River knew the thunder of that stallion's approach. Now the magnificent animal lay dying in Copper Ridge's dusty main street, and its mistress held a gun to the town doctor's head. "Well, get up," Mara commanded, stepping back while maintaining her deadly aim. "Move slow and keep your hands where I can see them." Elias rose carefully, his mind racing through possibilities. He could see her gang now, 5 hard-faced men positioned strategically around the clinic. The nearest townspeople had spotted the commotion and were retreating behind doorways and overturned wagons, their faces pale with recognition and terror. Inside, Mara gestured toward the clinic with her revolver. "Bring whatever you need to save him. That horse weighs 1,200 pounds. Elias said, sweat running down his back, despite the evening chill beginning to descend. "I'll need help moving him." Mara whistled sharply 2 short blasts that brought her men running. The first was a stocky Mexican with gold teeth and rope-scarred hands. The second, a tall, gaunt man whose face bore the pockmarks of childhood smallpox. They moved with military efficiency, sliding a canvas tarp beneath the stallion and dragging him toward the clinic entrance. "Careful with him," Mara snapped as they maneuvered through the doorway. "Damage him further, and I'll put bullets in both of you." The men exchanged quick glances, and Elias noticed something odd. A brief moment of eye contact between the Mexican and the gaunt man that seemed to carry meaning beyond the current situation. But it passed quickly, and he dismissed it as his imagination. Inside the clinic, Elias surveyed his patient by flickering lamplight. The stallion was, indeed, magnificent coal black, with white markings on face and legs clearly bred for both speed and endurance. But the bullet wound was serious, positioned dangerously close to major blood vessels. Infection had set in, creating angry red webs of inflammation that spoke of days spent traveling hard across the unforgiving desert. "How long has he been like this?" Elias asked, setting his medical bag on the examination table with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline. 4 days. Mara replied, never lowering her weapon. "We hit a bank in Tucson. Guard got lucky with a rifle shot as we were leaving town." Elias nodded, already calculating what needed to be done. Surgery to extract the bullet, assuming it hadn't fragmented near vital organs. Thorough cleaning and drainage of infected tissue. Morphine for pain management, though he wasn't certain how the animal would react to opiates in its weakened condition. "I'll need to," he began. "You'll need to save him." Mara interrupted. She reached into her coat and produced a leather pouch, spilling gold coins across his instrument table. The metal gleamed like scattered stars in the lamplight. "That's $500. More than most folks see in 5 years. Elias stared at the gleaming currency, then at the woman who commanded fear across 3 territories. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. And if I can't save him, Mara's eyes were the color of winter's sage, cold and unforgiving as a mountain storm. Then you'll be joining him in whatever comes after this life. The bullet had lodged itself in the worst possible location, barely an inch from the stallion's heart, surrounded by infected tissue that would need complete removal. Elias probed the wound with gentle fingers, feeling the animal's elevated temperature and rapid irregular pulse. His own pulse was racing now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. He needs immediate surgery, Elias announced, scrubbing his hands in a basin of carbolic solution. The sharp chemical smell burned his nostrils. I'll have to extract the bullet and clean out all the infected material. It's delicate work that requires... Then get started, Mara said. First, I need to sedate him properly. An animal this size conscious during surgery, no drugs. Mara's voice was flat as a tombstone. I've seen too many horses never wake up from that poison. Elias turned to face her fully, his medical instincts warring with self-preservation. Ma'am, operating on a conscious horse is nearly impossible. He'll fight the restraints, could tear the surgical site open, possibly cause fatal hemorrhaging. He won't fight. Mara moved to the stallion's head, placing her scarred hand on his neck. Incredibly, the animal's ears twitched at her touch, and some of the tension seemed to drain from his powerful frame. We've survived worse together than this. I understand your concern, but medical science clearly indicates... The sharp click of her revolver's hammer cut him off. Doctor, this isn't a medical school debate. You'll operate without sedation, or I'll find someone else who will. Outside voices were growing louder, townspeople gathering despite the obvious danger. Someone was shouting orders, probably Sheriff Morrison trying to organize some response. But what could they do? Any assault on the clinic would likely result in their doctor's death, and Elias was irreplaceable in a territory where qualified physicians were rarer than honest politicians. If he dies because you won't allow proper sedation... Elias said, selecting his instruments with hands that shook slightly. His blood will be on your hands, not mine. For just a moment, something flickered behind Mara's controlled facade. Fear, perhaps, or pain, buried deep as a mine shaft. But it vanished so quickly that Elias wondered if he'd imagined it. Just save him, she whispered. And for an instant her voice carried a vulnerability that seemed completely at odds with her fearsome reputation. Elias positioned his scalpel at the wound's edge. The stallion's hide was slick with perspiration and dried blood, the infection creating a spider web of red inflammation around the bullet hole. He'd performed surgery under impossible conditions before treating Apache arrow wounds while under fire, setting bones during cavalry charges, but never with a gun literally pressed to his skull and his patient fully conscious. He hold him steady, he told Mara's men who had positioned themselves at the horse's legs. No matter what happens, don't let go. The blade sliced into flesh and the stallion screamed. The sound was unlike anything in Elias's experience. Pure agony, given voice reverberating off the clinic walls with such force that bottles rattled on their shelves and dust rained from the rafters. The horse's massive body arched upward, every muscle straining against the hands, trying to restrain him. The wooden floorboards groaned under the tremendous pressure. Jesus Cristo, the Mexican muttered, fighting to maintain his grip on the animal's rear legs as they thrashed with desperate strength. Hold him, Mara shouted, pressing both hands against the stallion's neck while whispering what sounded like Apache words. Don't you dare let go. The horse convulsed again, more violently this time, and Elias felt the surgical site tear slightly under the pressure. Blood began flowing more freely, and he had to pause his work to apply pressure with gauze pads. He's fighting too hard. Elias said, his voice tight with concentration. The wound is tearing open. I need... A rifle shot cracked outside, followed immediately by Sheriff Morrison's voice. Doc Boone, you all right in there? Answer him. Mara ordered, her gun now pressed against Elias's shoulder blade. Tell him you're fine and to stay back." "I'm unharmed, Sheriff." Elias called out, not taking his eyes off his work, as the stallion thrashed again. "But stay clear of the building. Who's got you, Duck?" Elias glanced at Mara, who nodded grimly. "Mara DeWitt and her gang. They want medical treatment for their horse." A moment of stunned silence from outside, then an explosion of angry voices. Morrison's bellow cut through the chaos. "Surround the building, set up crossfire positions. Nobody enters or leaves without my say-so." Mara smiled without warmth, but Elias noticed her knuckles were white where she gripped her revolver. "Looks like we're all committed now, Doctor." The surgery was becoming a nightmare of blood and screaming. Each time Elias made an incision, the stallion would convulse with agony, threatening to tear the wound wider and cause fatal hemorrhaging. The animal's heart rate was climbing dangerously, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. Sweat poured down Elias's face as he worked the acrid smell of carbolic acid, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. "I can't see clearly," he muttered, using gauze to absorb the flowing blood. His hands were shaking now from the adrenaline and strain. "The bleeding is too heavy. I need my assistant." What assistant? Mara demanded, her own face pale with stress. "Clara Henderson. She helps with surgeries, holds instruments, keeps wounds clear so I can work. She lives across the street." Mara peered through the window, where voices continued shouting outside. The temperature was dropping as full darkness approached, and she could see her breath misting slightly in the air. "And you think Sheriff Morrison will just let some girl walk in here? She's 17 years old and weighs about 100 pounds. Elias said, frustration creeping into his voice as the stallion thrashed again, tearing his careful sutures. What possible threat could she pose to 5 armed outlaws? The gaunt man with the pockmarked face laughed harshly. Could be carrying a hideout pistol. Could be planning to signal the law somehow. Or... Elias said, his voice sharp with desperation, as blood continued to flow. She could help save your leader's most prized possession. Your choice. Mara studied the stallion's labored breathing for a long moment. The animal was clearly suffering, and time was running out. The wound kept tearing open despite his efforts, and she could see the doctor was struggling. Finally, she nodded to the Mexican. Joaquin, call for this girl. Tell them she can enter, but if she tries anything clever, we'll kill her and the doctor both. As Joaquin moved to the window to shout Mara's demands, Elias noticed something odd about the man's behavior. The Mexican kept glancing toward the gaunt outlaw, and there was a strange tension in his shoulders that seemed out of place. When he called out to the townspeople, his voice carried an undertone that Elias couldn't quite identify, almost as if he were trying to convey some hidden message. After several minutes of heated negotiation outside, punctuated by more gunshots that made everyone in the clinic flinch, the door opened slowly, and Clara Henderson stepped inside. She was a small, pretty girl with brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a simple blue dress, now dusty from her sprint across the street. Her father owned the general store, and she'd been assisting Elias with medical cases for 2 years, showing natural aptitude for the work. Now her face was pale with terror, but her hands remained steady as she set down a basin of clean water. "What do you need me to do, Dr. Boone?" she asked quietly, though her voice shook slightly. "Hold these retractors to keep the wound open while I extract the bullet," Elias said, handing her the instruments. "And Clara, focus only on the horse. Ignore everything else." The girl nodded and took her position. Her presence made an immediate difference, giving Elias the steady hands he needed to navigate the maze of torn tissue and infection. But the bullet appeared to have fragmented, with pieces scattered throughout the muscle. More gunshots cracked outside, closer this time, and a bullet shattered one of the clinic windows, sending glass cascading across the floor. The stallion tried to rear up at the sudden noise, threatening to tear open all of Elias's careful work. "They're testing our defenses," Joaquin said nervously, but again Elias noticed that strange undertone in his voice. "Hold him down," Elias shouted, abandoning surgical precision to simply prevent further injury. as the horse thrashed wildly. That's when the gaunt outlaw suddenly lurched forward and grabbed Clara by the arm, yanking her away from the table. "Pretty little thing," he said with a gap-toothed grin, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Maybe we should take her along when we leave. Could be real useful on the trail, if you know what I mean." The response was instantaneous and violent. Mara spun around and struck the man across the face with her revolver barrel, the impact producing a wet crack that sent blood spurting from his shattered nose. "Touch her again, and I'll blow your brains across this room," Mara snarled. "We don't hurt innocents, ever." The outlaw, Garrett Elias, heard someone call him, staggered backward, pressing his hand to his bleeding face. His eyes blazed with murderous rage. "Since when do you care about some shopkeeper's brat?" "Since always," Mara replied coldly. "That's what separates us from animals like the Brennan gang. We have standards." But Elias noticed something troubling. Another quick exchange of glances between Joaquin and Garrett, lasting only a second but carrying clear meaning. These two men were planning something together. Clara had returned to her position, her hands trembling slightly, but still functional. Outside, the voices were growing more agitated. Someone was shouting about bringing dynamite from the mining office. "Sheriff won't blow up his only doctor," Joaquin said nervously, but there was that odd tone again. "Maybe not intentionally," another gang member replied. "But accidents happen in situations like this. We should finish and ride before this gets worse." A new voice cut through the air, outside harsh, commanding, unmistakably federal. "This is Deputy Marshal Frank Dalton with the United States Marshal Service. This building is completely surrounded. Come out with your hands raised." Mara's face went white as bleached bone. Federal marshals meant no negotiation, no mercy. They would wait as long as necessary, then storm the building with overwhelming force. "How many men does he have out there?" she asked Joaquin, who had moved to peer through the broken window. "Hard to tell in this darkness. 20, maybe 25, including townspeople. They've got rifles positioned on every rooftop with a clear shot." Again, Elias noticed something strange about Joaquin's assessment. The man's eyes kept darting toward specific positions outside, as if he were looking for particular individuals, rather than simply counting threats. The stallion chose that moment for another violent convulsion, nearly tearing the surgical site completely open. Elias pressed gauze against the spurting blood, feeling precious time slipping away, like sand through his fingers. "He's going into shock," he announced, his voice tight with strain. "His body can't withstand much more trauma." As Elias worked frantically to stabilize the horse's vital signs, he lifted the largest bullet fragment to examine it in the lamplight. What he saw made his world tilt on its axis, and his heart began hammering so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. Carved into the lead was a distinctive marking, a small D, enclosed in a perfect circle. It was identical to the custom stamp he'd seen 3 months earlier, when he desperately tried to save his daughter's life. The fragment Emma had died from bore this exact marking. For a moment, everything else faded: the stallion's labored breathing, Clara's quiet assistance, the shouts from outside. All Elias could see was that tiny mark, proof positive that Mara DeWitt's gang had been responsible for the raid that claimed his daughter's life. The bullets were too distinctive for coincidence. His hand began to tremble violently. The woman standing 5 feet away, holding a gun on him while he fought to save her horse, was directly responsible for Emma's death. All her talk of codes and rules about not harming innocents, it meant nothing. His 8-year-old daughter was dead because of this woman and her gang. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and confront her with the truth, to demand answers, to let justice take its course, whatever the cost. It would be so easy to let the stallion die: a single misplaced suture, a tiny air bubble in the wrong location, an accidental nick to a major blood vessel. But as he stared at the fragment, another image filled his mind. Emma on her deathbed, her small hand clutching his as fever consumed her young body. "Daddy," she had whispered with her last breath. "Don't let the anger make you like them, Doctor." Clara's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right? You've stopped moving?" Elias blinked, focusing on the girl's concerned face. The bullet fragment was still clutched in his forceps, its damning evidence gleaming in the lamplight. His hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold his instruments. "Just need a moment." He managed his voice sounding strange in his own ears, but Mara had noticed his distress. Those winter-colored eyes were studying his face with unsettling intensity. "Doctor, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Elias carefully placed the fragment on his instrument tray, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Nothing. Just the strain of operating under these conditions." But his mind was reeling. Should he confront her now? Should he sabotage the surgery and let her most prized possession die as his daughter had died? The moral weight of the decision was crushing him, and his hands continued to shake despite his efforts to control them. "The wound is clean now," he announced finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to suture the internal damage and pack it with antiseptic gauze." The Stallion was quieter now, its strength nearly exhausted from the ordeal. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll, and Elias could see death approaching in the animal's glassy eyes. Whatever decision he made, it needed to be soon. As he began the delicate process of suturing torn blood vessels, chaos erupted outside. Gunfire cracked through the night air, single shots at first, then rapid exchanges that made the clinic walls shake. Someone screamed in pain or terror. "What's happening?" Clara whispered, her face pale in the lamplight. Joaquin peered through the broken window, and Elias noticed that strange tension in his posture again. "Looks like some townspeople tried to rush the marshal's position. Thought they could end this quick and dirty." More gunfire much closer now. A bullet punched through the clinic wall, sending splinters flying. Another shattered what remained of the window, and cold night air began pouring into the room. The Stallion tried to rear up at the sudden noise, threatening to tear open all of Elias's careful work. "Hold him down." Elias shouted, his decision made. Despite everything, he couldn't let an innocent animal suffer. His hands moved with renewed precision, suturing and cleaning with the skill that had kept him alive on the frontier for 8 years. That's when he noticed Garrett was no longer at his assigned position. The outlaw had moved toward the rear of the clinic, his hand resting on his gun butt with obvious intent. Worse, he was exchanging meaningful glances with Joaquin, quick, furtive looks that confirmed Elias's growing suspicion that these two men were planning treachery. "Mara," Elias said urgently, but it was too late. Garrett drew his weapon and pointed it directly at Mara's back, while Joaquin simultaneously swung his rifle toward her position. "Sorry, boss," Garrett said with a blood-crusted grin. "But $5,000 federal bounty beats loyalty any day of the week. Make that split 2 ways," Joaquin added with a cold smile. "I've been talking to Marshal Dalton for weeks, waiting for the right moment to cash in." The double betrayal unfolded in seconds that felt like hours. Mara found herself caught between 2 guns with nowhere to run and no cover except the examination table where her dying horse lay. "Drop your iron, Mara," Garrett commanded. Nice and slow. But Mara DeWitt hadn't survived 5 years as the territory's most wanted outlaw by being slow to react. Instead of complying, she threw herself sideways, using the examination table as cover. Her sudden movement startled the Stallion, which reared up with a scream of pain and terror. The surgical site tore open like a burst dam, spraying blood across the clinic walls in arterial spurts. The horse's steel-shod hooves came down hard on the wooden floor, splintering planks as it fought against pain and confusion. In the chaos, Elias found himself gripping the animal's lead rope, desperately trying to calm the beast before it bled to death. "Easy, boy." He gasped, But the stallion was beyond reason, now driven mad by agony and the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. Garrett fired first, his shot going wide as Mara rolled behind an overturned chair. Joaquin's rifle barked a split second later, the bullet punching through the chair's wooden back and sending splinters flying. The sound of gunfire inside the clinic triggered immediate response from the federal marshals outside. More shots began pouring through the windows and walls. $5,000, Garrett shouted to anyone who would listen. Federal bounty for Mara DeWitt, dead or alive. We can all be rich men. But the remaining gang members, those who hadn't been part of the conspiracy, were scrambling for position, their loyalty to Mara overriding greed. The clinic became a maze of crossfire as federal marshals outside tried to distinguish between targets. The stallion chose that moment to bolt. Despite its grievous injuries, the great horse gathered what remained of its strength and leaped toward the clinic's front window. Elias, still holding the lead rope, was yanked off his feet and dragged along as 1,200 pounds of panicked horseflesh crashed through glass and wooden framework in an explosion of debris and blood. He hit the ground hard outside the clinic, his ribs screaming with pain as he struck a hitching post. Glass cuts covered his face and hands, and blood was running into his eyes. The stallion was thrashing beside him, its legs folding under the weight of reopened wounds that painted the dusty street crimson. All around them, chaos reigned. Federal marshals were shouting orders while townspeople scrambled for cover. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireflies, and the air filled with the whine of bullets and the acrid smell of burned gunpowder. "Okay, don't move, Doctor." Marshal Dalton's voice cut through the noise as he approached with his rifle ready. Behind him, at least 20 men had weapons trained on the clinic, waiting for clear targets. "The horse is dying," Elias said, struggling to his knees despite the pain in his ribs. "I need to get him back inside and—" "That animal belongs to Mara DeWitt," Dalton replied coldly. "Let it die in the street where it belongs." But even as he spoke, the sound of intensified gunfire erupted from inside the clinic. Mara was fighting for her life against two traitors who knew her habits and weaknesses, while federal bullets poured through every opening. The distinctive crack of her Colt .45 was answered by the deeper roar of rifles, creating a deadly symphony that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Suddenly, smoke began pouring from the clinic's windows. Someone had knocked over an oil lamp in the fighting, and the dry wood was catching with terrifying speed. Orange flames were already visible through the broken glass, spreading with the hunger of something alive. "Clara!" Elias shouted, remembering the girl was still trapped inside. The stallion managed to stand, blood streaming from its reopened wounds, but its eyes, clearer now, focused on the clinic where its mistress was battling for survival. The great horse took a faltering step toward the building, then another, driven by a bond that transcended mere ownership. He wants to go back to her, Elias realized, watching the animal's desperate struggle. "And then he's as stupid as his owner," Marshal Dalton said. "They're both going to die in that inferno." The flames were spreading rapidly now, consuming everything in their path and threatening to spread to adjacent buildings. The heat was becoming intense enough that men were backing away from the clinic, shielding their faces against the growing inferno. Then the door exploded outward as Mara dove through it, her long coat smoking and torn. She hit the ground rolling and came up with her Colt, ready, scanning for immediate threats. Behind her, flames were consuming the clinic's interior, creating a hellish backdrop of orange light and choking black smoke. "Clara!" Elias shouted again, his heart pounding with fear for the girl. Mara's head snapped around as she saw the same thing he did. Thick smoke pouring from the building flames, spreading through rooms where a 17-year-old girl was trapped. Without hesitation, she sprinted back toward the burning clinic. "Stop right there!" Marshal Dalton commanded, his rifle trained on her back. Mara ignored him completely. She disappeared into the smoke-filled building just as another section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris. The heat was so intense now that paint was blistering on nearby buildings. Federal marshals and townspeople alike were frozen by the spectacle the territory's most wanted outlaw had just run into a burning building to save a girl she barely knew. "Christ almighty," someone whispered. "She's gone completely insane." Seconds stretched like years. The flames were spreading with increasing ferocity, consuming everything combustible and threatening to turn the entire block into an inferno. The heat was so intense that men 100 feet away could feel it searing their faces. Then Mara emerged again, carrying Clara in her arms. But the girl was unconscious, overcome by smoke, and Mara herself was in terrible condition. Her hands and face were covered with angry red burns where flames had touched her, and her clothing was smoldering. She stumbled as she carried Clara clear of the building, her strength nearly exhausted. She set the girl down gently in the street, then tried to return to the burning clinic. "Clara needs more help," she gasped to Elias. There's still smoke in her lungs. But as she turned back toward the inferno, the remaining roof collapsed completely, sending up a pillar of sparks that could be seen for miles. The clinic was gone, consumed by flames that continued to spread toward neighboring buildings. "It's too late," Elias said, checking Clara's pulse. The girl was breathing but shallowly, and her skin was pale from smoke inhalation. That's when Joaquin emerged from behind the clinic, his rifle trained not on the federal marshals, but on Mara herself. The Mexican's face was twisted with greed and desperation, all pretense of loyalty finally abandoned. $5,000. He said, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "That's enough to disappear forever, start over where nobody knows my name or face." The ultimate betrayal was complete now. Mara was surrounded federal marshals on one side, her own treacherous lieutenant on the other, with a dying horse and an unconscious girl at her feet. The clinic burned behind her like a vision of hell itself, casting dancing shadows across the scene of her impending capture or death. But she didn't look defeated. If anything, there was something like peace in those winter sage eyes, as if a burden she'd carried for years was finally about to be lifted. "Go ahead, Joaquin," she said quietly, her burned hands hanging loose at her sides. "Take your blood money. But first answer me, this was it worth it, selling out the only family you ever had?" Joaquin's rifle wavered slightly. "You ain't my family. Family doesn't get you hunted across half the territories by federal marshals." "No," Mara agreed, looking at her stallion as she spoke. "But family protects each other. Family doesn't abandon wounded companions when things get difficult." She was speaking to her horse, and Elias realized she wasn't talking about her gang at all. The bond between woman and animal transcended mere ownership. It was partnership forged in danger and sealed with mutual trust that had kept them both alive through countless perils. The first shot came from somewhere in the crowd. Elias never learned who fired it. But in the tense atmosphere, with dozens of armed men facing off in the flickering light of the burning clinic, one gunshot was all it took to unleash hell. Joaquin's rifle spoke first, but Mara was already moving, diving toward the water trough beside the clinic. The bullet struck sparks from the metal rim, missing her head by inches. Federal marshals opened fire at anything that moved, while townspeople scrambled for cover behind wagons and buildings. The night air filled with the deadly whine of bullets and the acrid smell of gun smoke. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like a thunderstorm, and the sound of gunfire echoed off every building in town. Elias found himself in the middle of the chaos, crouched beside Clara's unconscious form, with lead flying overhead from multiple directions. The stallion was down again this time from a fresh wound in its flank, and its breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Blood was pooling beneath the great horse, and Elias could see death approaching in its glassy eyes. Through the smoke and confusion, he saw Mara reach the water trough. But Joaquin was pursuing her, his rifle reloaded and ready. The Mexican had murder in his eyes now, all pretense of bounty hunting abandoned in favor of simple revenge against the woman who had controlled his life for so long. "Should have trusted me, Mara," Joaquin snarled, taking aim. "Should have stayed loyal," she replied, her own weapon coming up. They fired simultaneously. Joaquin's shot took splinters from the trough beside Mara's head, while her bullet took him center mass, spinning him around before he collapsed in the dust, with blood frothing from his lips. But the effort cost her dearly. As she tried to stand, Elias could see that she was favoring her left side, where dark stains were spreading through her coat. She'd taken at least one bullet during the exchange, and possibly more. Then Garrett appeared, emerging from the burning clinic with his gun in hand. The gaunt outlaw was badly burned, his clothes smoldering and his face blackened with soot, but he was still alive and still dangerous. He raised his weapon toward Mara's position, determined to claim the bounty even if it killed him. "Not yet, boss," he wheezed through smoke-damaged lungs. "We ain't finished our business." But before he could fire, the stallion summoned the last of its strength. The great horse lunged forward, striking Garrett with its shoulder and sending the outlaw sprawling. The impact tore open the animal's wounds even further, but it had accomplished its goal, protecting its mistress one final time. Garrett's gun went flying, disappearing somewhere in the darkness. The outlaw tried to crawl after it, but his injuries were too severe. He collapsed face first in the dirt, his body finally surrendering to the burns and smoke inhalation that had been slowly killing him. Marshal Dalton was advancing now, his rifle trained on Mara's position. "Mara DeWitt, this is your final warning. Surrender immediately, or we'll take you dead instead of alive." Mara's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Surrender to face a federal judge with my reputation. I'll be dancing at the end of a rope before the sun sets tomorrow." The flames from the clinic were spreading now, threatening nearby buildings, despite the bucket brigades that townspeople had formed. The air was thick with smoke and ash, creating an apocalyptic landscape lit by orange flames and muzzle flashes that turned night into a hellish parody of day. In the middle of it all, the black stallion was dying. Elias could see it in the animal's labored breathing, and the way its powerful chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty. The wounds, the stress, the smoke, it was all too much. The magnificent horse that had carried Mara DeWitt through countless adventures was finally succumbing to its injuries. Mara saw it too. Despite the federal marshals surrounding her, despite the flames and chaos and the blood running down her side, her attention was focused entirely on her dying companion. "Easy thunder walking," she whispered, crawling toward the horse despite the obvious danger. "Easy now, old friend." That's when Elias made his decision. The bullet fragment was still in his medical bag, damning evidence of his daughter's murder, proof that could see Mara DeWitt hanged. But as he watched her cradle the dying stallion's head, ignoring her own injuries and the guns trained on her, all he could see was a woman grieving for the thing she loved most in the world, just as he had grieved for Emma. Rising from his position beside Clara, Elias walked toward the water trough. Bullets were still flying sporadically, but the main firefight was winding down as ammunition ran low and cleared targets became scarce. "Doctor, get back." Marshal Dalton commanded, his rifle swinging toward Elias. She's still armed and extremely dangerous, but Elias kept walking until he was kneeling beside Mara and her horse. Up close, he could see that her injuries were serious bullet wounds in her side and shoulder, severe burns on her hands and face from the fire. The acrid smell of burned flesh mixed with gunpowder and smoke. "Let me help," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Mara looked at him with those winter-colored eyes, and for a moment the gunfire and chaos faded away. It was just a doctor and an outlaw united in their desire to ease the suffering of a dying animal. "He's dying," she whispered, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "I know," Elias replied, checking the stallion's pulse. "But we can make his passing easier." The standoff continued through the long hours before dawn, but the fire changed everything. As flames consumed what remained of the clinic and threatened to spread throughout Copper Ridge, practical concerns overrode the desire for immediate justice. Marshal Dalton ordered his men to help fight the blaze while maintaining careful watch on their prisoner. Mara made no attempt to escape. Instead, she remained beside Thunder walking as Elias worked to ease the stallion's suffering. The horse was beyond saving now, too much damage, too much blood loss, but at least its final moments could be peaceful. He was the finest horse I ever knew, Mara said softly as the animal's breathing grew shallow with approaching death. Carried me out of more impossible situations than I can count. What was his full name? Elias asked, checking Clara's pulse. The girl was breathing normally now, the smoke gradually clearing from her lungs as the cool night air helped her recover. Thunder walking on stone. Mara replied, her voice thick with grief. Apache name. Seemed fitting for a horse that could run like the wind across terrain that would kill other animals. Thunder walking died just as dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains, his great head resting in Mara's lap. She held him until the end, whispering words in Apache that Elias didn't understand but recognized as a warrior's farewell to a fallen comrade. When it was over, she gently closed the stallion's eyes and stood up slowly. Her face was streaked with tears and soot, but her expression was strangely calm and the look of someone who had finally found peace after years of running. Marshal Dalton. She called out, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. I'm ready to face whatever justice awaits me. But as the federal lawman approached with shackles, Elias stepped between them. Wait, he said, his heart pounding as he made the most important decision of his life. Dalton frowned impatiently. Doctor, step aside. This woman is a federal fugitive with a $5,000 bounty on her head. She saved Clara's life, Elias said. Risked her own to pull an innocent girl from a burning building not once, but twice, when the flames blocked her first escape route. That doesn't erase her crimes. No. Elias agreed. But it says something about her character that needs to be considered. He reached into his medical bag and pulled out the bullet fragment, the one with the distinctive marking that proved Mara's gang had killed his daughter. For a long moment, he stared at it, feeling the weight of 3 months' worth of grief and rage. Then he handed it to Mara. This came from your horse, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. But I think you should know, I found an identical bullet in my daughter 3 months ago. She died from wounds inflicted during your gang's raid on our bank. Mara's face went white as sun-bleached bone. She stared at the fragment as if it were a poisonous snake, then looked up at Elias with something approaching horror in her eyes. Your daughter, she whispered. The little girl who was killed in the crossfire. That was your child. Elias nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Emma Boone, 8 years old. She was walking to school when your gang hit the bank. For a moment, Mara seemed unable to speak. When she finally found her voice, it was barely audible above the crackling of dying flames and the distant sound of townspeople fighting the fire. I never knew she was your daughter, she said, her hands shaking as she held the bullet fragment. We had strict rules, no harm to innocents, especially children. But some of my men got excited during the raid, started shooting when they should have held their fire. I tried to stop them, screamed at them to cease firing, but the damage was already done. She trailed off, staring at the fragment with tears streaming down her soot-stained face. I'm sorry. I know those are just words, now meaningless words that can't bring her back. But I'm truly deeply sorry. Marshal Dalton was watching this exchange with growing impatience. But several townspeople had gathered close enough to hear, and their expressions were changing as they witnessed this moment of raw honesty. There's something else you should know, Marshal. Elias continued. While we were in the clinic, one of her own men tried to assault Clara. Mara stopped him, used her gun to protect an innocent girl from her own gang member. And then she risked her life multiple times to save that same girl from the fire. Sheriff Morrison added, approaching from the crowd of firefighters. I saw it myself. Ran into those flames without any thought for her own safety. Dalton looked around at the gathered townspeople, many of whom were nodding in agreement. The political landscape was shifting. It was one thing to arrest a notorious outlaw, quite another to arrest someone who had just performed multiple acts of genuine heroism. The law is the law, Dalton said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. But I suppose there might be mitigating circumstances that need to be considered by a judge and jury. As the sun climbed higher over the smoldering ruins of what had been Copper Ridge's only medical clinic, Elias found himself sitting beside Thunder Walking's body, waiting for the undertaker to arrive. The Stallion would be buried on the hill overlooking town Mara's final request before facing whatever justice awaited her. But she wasn't facing the gallows after all. A combination of factors had worked in her favor: Clara's tearful testimony about the rescue, Sheriff Morrison's grudging acknowledgement of her heroism, several townspeople vouching for her actions during the crisis, and most importantly, Elias's public refusal to press charges related to his daughter's death. I can't bring Emma back, he had told Marshal Dalton before the assembled crowd. And executing Mara DeWitt won't heal my grief or honor my daughter's memory. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about preventing future harm and recognizing genuine redemption when we see it. Instead of hanging, Mara faced a choice: 25 years in federal prison or permanent exile to Mexico, with the understanding that returning to United States territory would mean immediate execution. She chose exile without hesitation. Now, as morning painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Elias watched her prepare for the journey south. Her surviving gang members, those who hadn't been killed or arrested in the fighting, had already fled during the chaos. She would make this journey alone on foot, carrying only what she could fit in a small pack. "Doctor," she said, approaching him one final time. Her wounds had been properly treated now, her injuries cleaned and bandaged with supplies salvaged from the ruins. She would heal given time and care. "I wanted to give you this," she said, holding out a folded document. "It's a complete confession. Details about the bank raid, what really happened, who fired the shots that killed innocent people. There's also information about other crimes, including evidence that will clear a man currently serving time in Yuma Territorial Prison for a murder one of my former gang members committed." Elias unfolded the paper and read through Mara's clear, educated handwriting. The confession was comprehensive, providing details that would close cases across 3 territories and free at least one innocent man from wrongful imprisonment. "Why?" he asked, looking up from the document. Mara was quiet for a moment, her eyes focused on the distant mountains where Mexico lay waiting. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Because you showed me mercy when you had every right to demand vengeance. Because Clara Henderson is going to grow up to be a fine doctor if someone teaches her properly. Because—" She paused, struggling with words that had never come easily to her. "Because maybe it's time I stopped running from what I've done and started making amends for the harm I've caused." She knelt beside Thunder Walking's body one last time, placing her scarred hand on the Stallion's neck. The morning sun caught the tears on her face, making them shine like diamonds. "Take care of yourself, old friend," she whispered. "Wait for me on the far side of whatever comes next." Then she stood and began walking south, her long coat billowing in the morning breeze. Elias watched until she disappeared among the rocks and sagebrush, wondering if their paths would ever cross again. The answer came 3 years later in a letter postmarked from a small town in Sonora. It was written in the same clear handwriting he remembered. The package arrived a week later, filled with expensive medicines and surgical instruments, enough to stock a clinic twice the size of his old one. There was no return address, no way to send a reply, but that was appropriate. Some debts could only be repaid by living well and treating others with the same grace you had been shown. Clara Henderson had indeed become his full partner in the new clinic, her natural skill with medicine blossoming under his careful guidance. She never directly asked about that night of fire and gunplay, about the choice he had made to spare Mara DeWitt's life. But sometimes when they were working together to save someone else's child, Elias caught her watching him with something like understanding in her young eyes. On quiet evenings when the desert air grew cool and the mountains turned purple with approaching dusk, he would visit Emma's grave on the hill overlooking town. The marker was simple, just her name and dates carved in local stone by the same man who made headstones for everyone from miners to ministers. But beside it now stood another grave, marked with the words, "Thunder Walking on Stone," and the carved outline of a horse in full gallop. The Stallion's grave faced south toward Mexico, toward the distant mountains where second chances waited for those brave enough to seek them. As he stood there in the gathering twilight, Elias would sometimes hear the echo of his daughter's last words, "Don't let the anger make you like them." Emma had been 8 years old, dying from an outlaw's bullet, but somehow she had possessed wisdom that took him months to understand. Elias never learned if Mara DeWitt found the lasting peace she was searching for in those Mexican mountains. But he had found his own peace in the choice to heal rather than harm, to forgive rather than condemn, to show mercy, even when justice seemed to demand vengeance. The frontier remained a harsh and unforgiving place, still full of violence and desperate men who chose the wrong path. But it was also a land where people could start over, where the past didn't have to define the future, where even the most notorious outlaw could choose to become something better than what they had been. As the sun set over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in shades of redemption, Dr. Elias Boone picked up his medical bag and headed home. There would be other patients tomorrow, other chances to choose healing over hatred, mercy over vengeance.